Welcome. This is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. And this is Exploration. Every week in Exploration, we discuss the fascinating world of science and its impact on society. And today, leading off, we're going to depart from our usual schedule because we're going to try to summarize and try to make sense of the last presidential election, which, of course, made history unique in the annals of American history. And, of course, there's been trillions of words written in the past month about the victory of Donald Trump. But the question is, why? What was the driving force that propelled Donald Trump from being a celebrity into being the president-elect of the United States of America? Well, some people say it was racism. Some people say it was the revenge of the white working class. Other people say no, it was revolt against identity politics and the PC culture. Well, maybe it's a little bit of all the above. But I have a different point of view. My take, my 2 cents worth, is that the rise of Donald Trump and the rise of the Brexit movement is actually related to changes, revolutionary changes taking place in science and technology. That's right. Science and technology is the ultimate source of wealth in society. Yes, wealth can be traced back to the working class, can be traced back to entrepreneurs, can be traced back to good industrial policy and many other different kinds of factors. But ultimately, science and technology is the main driver of history and the economy. And to understand this election, I feel, in my own personal point of view, that you have to understand the fact that science does not progress in a steady straight line. Science progresses in waves. One revolutionary invention sets off an avalanche of secondary discoveries, which in turn changes modern society. So first of all, you have to realize that modern society as we know it is actually quite recent, only a few hundred years old. And you have to go back to 10,000 years with the melting of the ice, 10,000 years with the discovery of agriculture to understand the source of wealth in modern society. Yes, for the past 10,000 years, society lived in a wretched state of slavery and feudalism. Life was brutal and short. You were born, you grew up as a child, half starving, you had kids maybe, and then you died. In other words, life was a bitch. Lifespan, during that period of time, life expectancy was about the age of 30. In fact, it's often said that during this period, when a woman lived long enough to reach menopause, she died soon after that. In other words, life was very short, and life was brutal. But then something happened. Something happened about 200-300 years ago to change this horrible landscape. And what happened was the coming of the first wave of science and technology, with the coming of steam power and the Industrial Revolution. You see, we physicists contributed to this by working out the thermodynamics of coal and heat. We were able to calculate with mathematical accuracy the amount of energy you could extract from a lump of coal. And then, in turn, you could create locomotives. You could create steam factories. You could create the Industrial Revolution. And all of a sudden, wealth on a scale never seen before in the history of human race was created with the coming of steam power and especially the locomotive. However, this, of course, had many repercussions. This created a bubble. There was so much speculation in railroad stocks on the London Stock Exchange that it created a huge bubble, the bubble the likes of which had never been seen before in the annals of this young institution called capitalism. And the bubble was unsustainable. The bubble emerged in railroad stock. There were about 200 railroad companies registered on the London Stock Exchange, and it was unsustainable. The bubble popped in 1850, creating the first great crisis of capitalism. The crisis was so severe that it created a backlash in the form of Marxism. So Marxism, in turn, can be viewed historically and scientifically as a revolt against the excesses of capitalism during the first great revolution of science, the coming of steam power. We should also point out that this revolutionized society. The working class was created as a byproduct of this great industrial revolution. In fact, if you watch Downton Abbey on PBS television, you have to ask yourself a simple question. What happened to the great manors and the great mansions of old? What happened to them? These mansions employ perhaps 100 servants serving the very privileged aristocracy, but what happened? If you read between the lines and listen very carefully to Downton Abbey, you can see that what happened was the coming of the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, a farmer, a peasant, didn't have to be a peasant or work on the manor's estate. You could be a worker and work on the railroads. You could work in a factory. You didn't have to have slave wages working for the master in an aristocratic manner. No. You could work in a factory. And so with the rise of steam power came the rise of the working class. Peasants, farmers rushed to the cities to become industrial workers. And then we had the second great revolution in science and technology, and that's the coming of electricity, magnetism, and the internal combustion engine. Yes, we physicists were able to work out Maxwell's equations, which govern electricity and magnetism, and also perfect a new source of energy. Instead of calculating how many joules of energy you could extract from a lump of coal, we could calculate precisely how many joules of energy we could extract from a gallon of gasoline. And that created the rise of industrial unionism. Yes, the great working class unions of Detroit emerged out of the cauldron of this second great revolution, the revolution in electricity, magnetism, and the internal combustion. And again, for the second time in history, this created a bubble even bigger than the bubble of 1850. And this bubble was in two areas. If you trace back the crash of 1929, you realize that most of the speculation took place in two kinds of stock. One was utility stock because of the rise of electricity and magnetism and the rise of the automobile. And so again, two revolutions unleashed by physicists created wealth on a scale that was unimaginable in the 1920s. It created a bubble which crashed in 1929. And so you begin to realize that the crash of 1929 was very similar to the crash of 1850. Coinciding with the rise of a new source of science and technology, this time the car and electricity and magnetism. And this also, of course, created a revolution in the working class. The working class now became unionized in these gigantic unions, ultimately creating the AFL-CIO. And it also changed the political scene of the United States for many generations. This was the rise of the Roosevelt Coalition. The Roosevelt Coalition cobbled together three main factors of American society after 1929. First of all, you had the white industrial unionized worker, the bedrock of the Roosevelt Coalition. Then you had African Americans, and then you had urban workers and intellectuals. A combination of these three legs created the Roosevelt Coalition, which in turn dominated American politics until recently. And so we see that the rise of the second great revolution created not just the industrial working class, it created the industrial unions and the Roosevelt Coalition. Then we have the third wave of science and technology. And the third wave was initiated again by physicists who created the transistor and the laser. The transistor made possible the computer and all the labor-saving devices and the internet. And the laser, of course, is found everywhere, from the supermarket all the way to satellites and to lasers. And this created good and bad changes in society. First of all, the third wave made possible globalization. Because the Internet reduced the distances between societies, it meant that technology could spread rapidly at the speed of light. I remember when I was a grad student, and if you were a poor student in India subscribing to a physics journal, you had to wait months for the journal to arrive, if it arrived at all. And that, of course, impeded scientific progress and industrialization. Now we see that China is basically industrializing in one generation. This had never happened before in the history of the human race. The rapid rise of industrialization, in part due to globalization and the coming of the Internet. This also made possible the education of the people of the world because of the Internet. The high-tech revolution made possible the Internet and the democratization of knowledge. All of a sudden, people in an oppressed nation realize that other countries didn't have to suffer under a dictatorship, and this gave rise to democratic movements, which in turn overthrew many of the dictators of the past. I remember during the Cold War, there was something called the dictator for life. That is, if you were a puppet of the United States or the Soviet Union, you could be guaranteed longevity, at least until the end of the Cold War, because you were a pawn in this much larger game. Now, of course, dictators for life have no meaning at all, because the Cold War is over. And look at all the dictators that have been overthrown just in the past few decades. And so the rise of democracy also means the lessening of wars, because democracies do not war with other democracies. So you see, with the coming of the third wave, we had the benefits, the rise of hundreds of millions of people in China and India rising to the working class. We also had the spread of the Internet, the spread of democracy, the spread of globalization, and the spread of democratic forces in many countries around the world. Those are the positive aspects of this globalization, the third wave, energized by the computers. However, there are, of course, bad aspects as well. First of all, you realize that globalization also made possible runaway shops. Runaway shops which hollowed out entire industries. The industrial working class took a blow. The irony is that science and technology created the industrial working class. The irony is that science and technology don't wait for anybody. We now have the rise of computers, the lasers, the rise of high technology and globalization, which means the hollowing out of the industrial working class, and that in turn can explain the rise of Brexit in England and the UK and the rise of Donald Trump here in the United States. You know, some people point to the top 1%, and yes, they have benefited enormously because of globalization, but that in some sense misses the big picture. The big picture is that 1/3 of society, plus or minus, of course, but about 1/3 of society actually did very well under the third revolution. High technology was a blessing to about 1/3 of the population which were globalized, which did live in cities, which knew how to use computers to their advantage. However, 2/3 of American society did not do so well. They've seen their incomes either flatten out or begin to fall. And these are the people that are in part driving the Donald Trump revolution. And we have to realize that about 1/3 of society also went to college. About 2/3 of society did not finish college. And so we see a correlation between wealth, globalization, and a college education. And what links all this together is science and technology. If you know science and technology, you could begin to take advantage of your college education to reap the riches of urban society because you are globalized. Your income is no longer just a question of a local market. Your income now comes from the entire planet Earth. And so globalization has created winners and losers. Now, of course, this is not new. Look at the blacksmith. We no longer have blacksmiths. We no longer have wagon makers. But we don't mourn the fact that we no longer have blacksmiths and wagon makers because we have the automobile and automobile workers with the rise of the industrial unionized working class. But as I said before, science and technology don't wait for anyone. We're now in the third wave of science and technology, and the other downside is that it created a bubble just like the one of 1850, the bubble just like the one of 1929. The bubble was created in 2008, and this time it did not go into railroad stock. It did not go into utility stock and automobile stock. It went into real estate speculation. All this excess capital, the riches created by the high-tech revolution, energized the bubble of 2008. And when it crashed, it wiped out trillions of dollars in wealth. Now, the point here is that you cannot really understand American politics without understanding the waves of technology and science. The first wave, the steam power wave, created the industrial worker. The second wave, that is electricity and magnetism and the car, created the unionized industrial worker. However, the third wave is creating a large service sector, which doesn't pay as much as unionized industrial work, and it is creating a loss of jobs felt in Europe, felt in the United States, and that in turn, in part, explains the rise of Brexit and the rise of Donald Trump. Now, if this thesis that I'm laying out is correct, if it's correct, it means you can also predict the future. Because science and technology are not random. We can see the beginnings of a fourth wave in the creation of wealth in society. And the fourth wave is going to be a combination of artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and biotechnology. We're just beginning to see the beginnings of the emergence of the fourth wave. And so this, of course, is going to have enormous repercussions for the job market. Because if you train workers to be in jobs that are going to be obsolete, that, of course, is a total waste of time. For example, if you read my book, Physics of the Future, it gives a detailed analysis of what jobs will flourish and what jobs will disintegrate in the future. The big loser in the fourth wave is repetitive workers. Manual workers that do the same thing over and over again, because computers are adding machines. That's what they do well. Repetitive work over and over again. However, robots and computers have a weakness, several weaknesses, and that's where the jobs of the future are going to be. For example, pattern recognition, understanding patterns. Robots are very bad at that. Robots today have the intelligence of a cockroach, in fact, in terms of their pattern recognition capability, which means that gardeners, which means that construction workers, police, sanitation workers, semi-skilled, non-repetitive work will flourish in the future because robots cannot pick up garbage. They cannot recognize each piece of garbage. Robots do not understand crime and how to find the culprit. Robots cannot become construction workers because every construction site is different. So non-repetitive, semi-skilled jobs are going to flourish even in the working class. Now, among white workers, it's the middlemen that are going to suffer the most. These are the brokers, the agents of society, sometimes called the friction of capitalism. They do basically bean counting and inventory. They keep track of things. They search for things, keep track of things, and hey, that's what software does very well. For example, if you're working in a law firm, the bad news is that the paralegals will gradually be phased out. Because search engines, well, like I said, this is nothing but the work of an adding machine. And that's what robots do well. Robots can replace those people involved in agency, brokerage, tellers, and, as I said, the middlemen jobs For example, the search engine jobs required of a paralegal in a law firm. Now, the other news is, the bad news is, in the future we will have lawyers. And why is that? Because lawyers involve intellectual capital. And that's the lesson that I'm going to try to get across. Commodity capital is gradually being replaced by intellectual capital. Tony Blair of England, former Prime Minister, liked to say that England derives more revenue from rock and roll than the coal mining industry. You see, coal is a commodity. Its price drops over a period of time. It fluctuates, of course, but it drops on average over a long period of time. And coal is sort of like the symbol of the British working class. However, rock and roll is intellectual capital, a product of the human mind. In other words, you can mass produce coal. You can systematize it, reduce it to a certain set of rules, and make it a commodity that can be systematized. However, rock and roll cannot be systematized. There's no equation to create the next big rock and roll hit. You can copy other hits, of course, but to create the next big hit, well, that requires a human being. And so you're not going to see that happening anytime soon. So, in other words, middlemen jobs are the jobs that are going to be threatened the most. For example, take a look at stockbrokers. Stockbrokers no longer sell stock. That may sound strange, but it's true. Stockbrokers do not sell stock. In the future, you'll simply buy stock by talking to your wristwatch. So why do you need a stockbroker? You need a stockbroker for intellectual capital. Somebody who understands experience, know-how, savvy, understands the ebbs and flows of the market, understands the big picture, understands the gossip on Wall Street. Robots are very bad at that. And that's where stockbrokers will have jobs in the future. So in other words, if you are a middleman, if you are an agent, if you are a broker, you can survive as long as you add value. Value meaning intellectual capital to what you're offering. If you don't do that, you'll go the way of the blacksmith and the way of the wagon makers. And again, we don't mourn wagon makers. We don't mourn the loss of blacksmiths because we have other jobs that were created by the science and technological revolutions of the past. So, in other words, science is changing society itself. It's changing the nature of jobs. It's changing the nature of capitalism as industrial capital, as commodity capital become less and less important compared to intellectual capital. And again, that's why education is so important, because we want to retrain workers. Now, then the other question is, how does that then deal with the election that we just had? Well, as I said before, Donald Trump was riding on a tidal wave that many people missed, a tidal wave of the fact that many people have been left out of the Third Great Revolution. In fact, they've been marginalized by the Third Great Revolution, the revolution of high technology. And then the question is, what do we do about it? Well, we cannot go back to industrial unionism. We cannot turn the hands of the clock back. However, we can make it easier for white workers to withstand the ebbs and flows of capitalism. First of all, we can make sure that they have unemployment compensation and they are retrained. They just don't get a paycheck in the mail. They are retrained into occupations which are thriving, which are the future, which do represent a higher level of science and technology requiring more skills. And this means support of community colleges, junior colleges, technical colleges, support of colleges which will retrain workers for the jobs of the future, not jobs of the past. Unfortunately, our educational system is quite deficient, and the baton may not be passed correctly to our educational establishment. Realize, for example, that at the high school level, we have one of the worst educational systems known to science. It turns out that our students score dead last for the last 20 years in almost every international competition in science and mathematics. That does not bode well for the future. In fact, one reason why America still produces high-tech geniuses and people that can lead us into the future is because we import brain workers. That is, intellectual workers come in through H-1B, a visa which does make possible a handful of the world's top scientists to come to the United States. However, we can't depend on that forever. 50% of Silicon Valley, for example, is foreign-born. That's right, 50% is foreign-born. Nationwide, 50% of our physicists, our PhD physicists, are foreign-born. At my university, the City University of New York, almost 100% of our graduate students in physics are foreign-born. We cannot rely on this forever. We're going to have a major overhaul in our educational system, because our educational system does a very good job educating students to live in the world of 1950. The only problem is we don't live in 1950 anymore. So our educational system is not totally defunct. It does create workers that are very fit to work in the world of 1950. But since we don't live in 1950 anymore, it means we have to have a major overhaul in our educational system. Also, there are going to be jobs opening up. For example, jobs in software, but also jobs in the medical field. The baby boomers are aging. They're not getting any younger. And it's going to put an enormous stress on our medical establishment. And biotechnology is going to flourish as a direct consequence of this revolution taking place in science. This means that we're going to be able to cure many illnesses that are today incurable, cure many forms of cancer, cure many diseases of the mind, for example, Alzheimer's diseases. These are things that scientists are working on right now, and it means that in the future, we may be able to extend the human lifespan. So the job market in biotechnology is going to explode as a consequence of the third and fourth wave of science and technology. Also, I personally believe that in the future, decades from now, the robotics industry will be bigger than the automobile industry. In fact, your car will become a robot. You'll talk to it, it'll argue with you, it'll take you where you want to go, find a parking spot for you, park itself. You're not going to have to worry about any of the inconveniences of the automobile age. And so, yes, I think that cars will become a subset of the robotics industry. Well, that concludes the first part of Exploration. Once again, this is Dr. Michio Kaku, Professor of Theoretical Physics at the City College of New York. And in the second part of Exploration, we're going to talk about innovation. We're going to talk about science and technology and the spirit of invention. And who else than Thomas Edison as the symbol of innovation and ingenuity and scientific genius. We're going to bring on Randall Strauss, a biographer of Thomas Edison, talking about the spirit of scientific discovery. Welcome. In the second half of Exploration, we're going to try to answer the question of, well, where does wealth come from anyway? You know, I was watching the Republican and the Democratic debates on television, and of course the question constantly comes up, where does prosperity come from? Well, you have to realize, first of all, that politicians are former lawyers. And when you're a lawyer and you ask yourself, where does wealth come from? Well, the answer is obvious. You sue Peter to pay Paul. But you see, when you sue Peter to pay Paul, that's a zero-sum game. You take away from one group and you give it to another. Well, when a lawyer becomes a politician and you ask them where does wealth come from, they say, well, taxes. You tax Peter to pay Paul. Now, of course, lawsuits and taxes have a role to play. I'm not saying that they're not important. But ultimately, they are zero-sum games. That is, you are redistributing the wealth. You're not creating wealth. Wealth creation ultimately comes from science. Now, that's not to say that labor, capital, the entrepreneur, government regulations, that's not to say that they don't also play a role, but ultimately, who invents the transistor? Who invents the laser? Who invents the television set? Who invents a space program? Scientists. So when you trace wealth all the way back to where it originally came from, you find that it's science and technology. So in the second half of exploration, we're going to try to answer some of the questions of, well, how do you create wealth? We're going to bring on the biographer of Thomas Edison. And now I'd like to introduce our special guest for today. He's Randall Strauss, a columnist for the New York Times, and he's written a delightful new book called The Wizard of Menlo Park, how Thomas Alva Edison invented the modern world. That's right, invented the modern world. We're talking about the man who invented the phonograph, invented the light bulb, invented the motion picture industry, invented the electric power grid, and most of what we today take for granted as the modern world. And the question is, what was the secret of his success? And if you are an entrepreneur, especially in Silicon Valley, what kinds of traits can you learn? What kind of tips can you learn by studying the life and the mistakes of the Wizard of Menlo Park? So once again, our special guest today is Randall Strauss. The book is called The Wizard of Menlo Park, and he's a columnist for the New York Times. The first question for you is, how did you get interested in writing a biography of this iconic figure, Thomas Edison?
About 10 years ago, I wrote a biography of Steve Jobs. I was looking at Jobs' attempt to found a second company after Apple, and he was a big fan of Edison. And in the course of doing research for that book, I kept running into Edison's name, and then the book that followed that, which was about Bill Gates and Microsoft, again, I ran into Mr. Edison. I think it's fair to say that anyone working in the high-tech industry today owes a lot to Edison, and many people feel that connection, that debt to the inventor's contributions that set up the infrastructure and also set up a model of the inventor/business person, the tech-savvy entrepreneur.
And also,
he served as an inspirational example for today's successful entrepreneurs. Yeah?
Okay. And, well, let's talk about his early years. Of course, he wasn't born rich. He didn't have scientist professors as parents. And yet he's a self-made man that changed the world. So what about his early years?
He received virtually no formal schooling. He was homeschooled for a few years by his mother, but not for very long, and was selling fruit and snacks on a train as a very young boy. And he was self-taught. And I think one reason we have long been curious about his earliest years is because he was really the last, you might say, the last prominent figure in a technical field who could get away with absolutely no formal schooling. In a way, he was an exception then, and he has remained a curious figure. It's as if the more formal training that is needed in a given scientific or technical field, the more interesting the Edison counterexample is.
I guess he shares some similarity with a Michael Faraday of England, who was also self-taught and born into poverty, was a bookbinder, and became one of the greatest scientists of the 1800s. So I guess there's some similarity there, except that Michael Faraday is on, I think, the 5-pound note. He's on the British money, but Edison is not on our money.
He is not. It's interesting. He had 6 children, and 2 of them went to MIT. One did not complete his degree, but his very youngest son, Theodore, did complete his degree and actually did some graduate work. And it's interesting the contrast between the formal training that the father received compared with his youngest son. So in the course of 2 generations, we see a change, a very dramatic change in what is necessary for being educationally equipped to create new things.
Okay, well, let's talk about his first great invention, which we take for granted, but if you could tell us a little bit about the shock that people felt when Edison invented the phonograph.
It did come as a shock, and we've lost that sense of awe that was present when the very first witnesses to this miracle heard it for the first time. Part of the shock was the physical dimensions. It was a small device. Essentially, it was a cylinder that was mounted with a crank, and a sheet of tinfoil was wrapped around it, and a stylus was placed on top, and the stylus was connected to a very, very crude device, essentially a microphone. And at the time, others had tried to recreate human speech by means of building machines that were closer to a pipe organ than anything else. They were large, they involved bellows, and here was this device that fit literally on a tabletop. There was not much to it, and that it could faithfully reproduce any human sound in any language. That was also very impressive to those early observers. Was something that no one before its invention literally had even conceived of, let alone imagined it would be possible to build.
Now, in your book, you detail how shocking it was, the headlines stating that you could finally hear the voices of dead people. You could record the voices of your father, your mother, Caruso, great politicians, and actually hear their voices after they're dead. That was stunning, right?
The idea was stunning, but let's remember there were no voices to be played initially, and in fact, that early demonstration phonograph was not really a practical machine. I mentioned it took you would wrap a sheet of tinfoil around it. What those witnesses who spoke excitedly about being able to hear dead poets in the future didn't realize was that once you took that sheet of foil off the machine, you could not put it back on and play. And all the demonstrations of the phonograph those early years involved Edison or his assistant recording and then instantly playing without touching that tin foil. And it would only be when he develops, he and his competitors, first a wax cylinder and then a disc, was the recording medium sufficiently durable to permit a separation of recording and playback.
Okay, now we'll talk about fame a little bit later because he becomes increasingly famous over the decades. But what was the reaction to this machine and the reaction of this man who performs this miracle of recording the human voice for the first time?
Well, part of the surprise was that the inventor was a young man. He was 30 years old. And he very shrewdly decided to unveil his machine in the offices of Scientific American. He takes the machine into the office, puts it on the table, and he has pre-recorded a self-introduction. So the phonograph says to the gathered editors, "Hello, I'm the phonograph." And it was stunning. And Scientific American literally stopped the presses. They had an issue that was in production at the time. The editors decided on the spot to hold that issue and insert notice of this wondrous invention. And that moment made Thomas Edison famous. When the phonograph is announced with the imprimatur of the Scientific American's editors behind it, it had instant credibility, and he became famous at that moment and would learn that once you achieve the kind of fame he was given, he could never become anything but the famous person. He couldn't turn off the fame. He could never become unfamous.
What do you mean by that? People chasing him for autographs or spying on him and looking at his garbage? Or what do you mean by that?
Well, he did not face quite the intrusiveness that celebrities today face, but it was pretty close. The world, first of all, when it becomes aware of his lab in what was then rural, suburban New Jersey, becomes aware of his laboratory, they descend upon it, and they think nothing of interrupting his work. And there's a time when he was unable to get much of anything done because visitors would come in and demand that he play for them a demonstration song, and the song that Edison was condemned to repeat again and again and again was Mary Had a Little Lamb. This was the price of fame. Fame got him a contract with investors to establish a company that was going to commercialize the phonograph, but fame at the same time brought a torrent of visitors, a torrent of mail. The mail would include a category of requests that he termed begging letters. Strangers would write him saying, "I need money," something I think famous people today would recognize as a phenomenon that persists today.
In fact, if you win the lottery, that's the first thing that happens, right? You get deluged by people who have their hands out.
And what I find is very interesting in looking at Edison's acquaintance with fame and the price it exacts is how the public has no compunction about respecting the privacy of the other person. Just incredible demands are made upon Edison, and at first he doesn't realize how big a burden it's going to be for him, for his family, and his children are going to always live in his shadow. So they're going to pay a price too.
Okay. Well, let's move on because Edison tops this. Not only is he now world-renowned, he goes on to invent the light bulb and the motion picture industry. So could you walk us through his succeeding inventions?
The phonograph comes when he's 30, and by the time he's 35, he's going to have announced that he's solved the problem of what was then called subdividing light, that is, coming up with a workable incandescent light bulb. At the time, arc lighting was dominating cities and was too bright for indoor use. He's going to announce he's invented it before he has. Then he's going to scramble to come up with solutions to problems he ran into in the course of trying to come up with the incandescent light bulb. Mm-hmm. Then he's going to form a company, land permission to build the first central power station that supplies indoor lighting system in Lower Manhattan.
That was on Pearl Street, right?
On Pearl Street, right.
Mm-hmm.
And he's going to succeed. When he turns the switch, it works. He's going to do all of this. So from phonograph to successful build-out of the first municipal incandescent lighting system and accompanying power infrastructure.
Okay, now
do all this in 5 years. Amazing.
Now, when I was a kid, I read a biography of Thomas Edison, and there's a famous story of how he would experiment with literally hundreds of different kinds of substances that would incondense in a light bulb to create the light bulb. And that became legendary. And there's that famous quotation that genius is, 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. How much of that story is true?
Well, let's start with that famous quote. It turns out I could find no documented evidence that he ever said that. If you track down the source that was used by earlier biographers, it turns out it's a phrase used by someone who claimed acquaintance with Edison, who was speaking it several decades after he claimed he had heard Edison use the phrase. But there's no certainly there is no document in Edison's own hand where he uses this.
Now, what about the story, though? The story, though, that he went through hundreds of substances before he finally got it right.
The story is true. They did go, and I'm using the plural they. It was he and his assistants. And part of the problem with the myth of the lone, inspired, hardworking inventor, the outsized image of Edison, the inventor, was he always, from very early on, even before, of course, the invention of the phonograph, he had a team of assistants. So it wasn't Edison alone. It was the assistants who were running through long lists of all kinds of materials to see what would serve well, what would last as a suitable filament. They had a lot of fun with this, too, just trying outlandish materials to see what would work. And it would be a strip of bamboo that would turn out to be the basis for the first generation of really workable incandescent bulbs. The other thing about this story that I think is interesting to look back on was how it was not informed by scientific theory. At the time, it was termed cut and try. That is, just try everything. Today, we would more colloquially say throw some stuff against the wall and see what sticks. And that really was the technique. And, of course, this approach, this methodology, if I can dignify it with the term methodology, it's really the absence of a methodology, is not going to be a serviceable model for the institutionalization of invention that's going to follow Edison's career. He's going to be the one who makes this an appealing kind of storybook approach to invention, but it's not an approach that corporations are going to copy as they institutionalize invention.
Okay, let me ask you about a famous story about Edison. He was suspicious of people with fancy degrees from colleges. He was going to hire, according to the story, this one PhD, and he asked him to calculate the volume inside a light bulb. Okay, so this PhD candidate got out and used calculus, and after many, many hours came out with a number that approximated the volume inside a light bulb. And then Edison simply got the light bulb, put it under a faucet, put water in the faucet, and then simply weighed the water and got the calculation within a matter of seconds, just to prove that you don't need so much book learning. Is that really true?
It's a true story. I saw several different accounts of it. It involved actually an employee of his, and you have to feel sorry for the PhD who was hired for his training, but was subject to really what were cruel pranks. Edison felt so ambivalent about those who had received who had graduate degrees, who had received advanced training. He couldn't resist looking for opportunities to humiliate his most highly trained staff. And that's a great example of this ambivalence.
Okay, now tell us a little about the motion picture industry.
Motion pictures are going to be a passion of his. He works on a camera that is going to advance the field. He's going to buy the rights to use a projecting system that really makes possible the ability of audiences to see motion pictures on a screen. He was not able to invent that himself, and he and his advisors were willing to acquire the technology and market it under his name. He understood that he had acquired a reputation that had commercial value, and just the association of his name made this technology viable. It was an incredibly competitive marketplace. There were a number of competing projection systems that were all jostling with one another. He was also involved in the production of movies. He had a movie studio, and under his name, a number of very important early movies, very short movies, were made until he did eventually leave the business. He, in movies as in recorded sound, enjoyed the privilege of making artistic decisions about what would get produced, what kind of movies, what kind of musicians would receive his support. And so we have the case of an inventor wielding power into in the artistic realm. And he enjoyed that role very much.
Okay, let me ask you the key question then. What was the secret of his genius? Was it that he was born that way? Was it that he simply tried everything under the sun until he got it right? What was the secret of his genius that, of course, Silicon Valley entrepreneurs today try to emulate?
He's certainly a serial entrepreneur, and he was very gifted with in a technical sense of being able to identify the crux of a technical problem, being able to guide his assistants in the search for a solution. And in our memory of the Edison legend, just as is the case today in Silicon Valley, we do remember the successes, and we are inclined to forget the failures. Steve Jobs is a great example. I mentioned I'd written a book about his career when he started this second company. I would imagine most people certainly know of his recent successes as well as his early successes, but probably don't remember there was this interval of about 10 years where he tried to start and failed in making a new company that offered a workstation, high-end computer for a academic market. And so, too, in the case of Edison's career, there are times when he tries something and fails utterly. The most dramatic example was when he left the electric light power business and basically liquidated his stock that he received in the creation of what's going to become General Electric, and puts virtually all of his money into iron ore mining in a venture that did not work out. That's part of being a serial entrepreneur. You will succeed, but not always. So I don't think that detracts from his successes. And some of his failures were glorious failures. We can talk about the electric car as what I think of as one of his glorious failures.
Well, that concludes our interview with Randall Strauss, author of a new book about Thomas Edison. And stay tuned for the second half of Exploration when we talk about the next generation of innovators. And the question is, what can we learn about the spirit of creativity, innovation that will create wealth into the future? Think of the enormous wealth generated by the light bulb and by the work of Thomas Edison. And the question is, are we up to the task? Can we create the next generation of Thomas Edisons? And Thomas Edison, in turn, depended upon the work of Faraday, Maxwell, even Benjamin Franklin, people who began to tease apart the physics and the mathematics behind electricity and magnetism. In the same way, we can foresee the coming of the fourth wave of technology. Not steam power, not electricity and magnetism, not even computers and lasers. But the fourth wave of wealth generation will be artificial intelligence and biotech and nanotech. These are going to be the drivers of wealth creation in the future. And so, yes, we're waiting for the next Thomas Edison to come along to take these disciplines and out of them create wealth. In other words, to create industries that people want, that people will pay for, that will enrich people's lives and also employ other workers in the process. In the same way that steam power opened up the West, opened up the industrialization of society, created the working class,
In the same way that electricity and magnetism and the automobile created the automobile worker and the electrical worker, in the same way that high tech has created computer programmers as well as people that are involved with intellectual capital, in the same way we can foresee a time when the fourth wave generates a new wave of innovation, science, discovery, and of course, wealth creation and jobs. Well, I'm afraid our time is up for exploration. Good day.